In this video, I'll show you how to use my recently released product, my hanging paper lanterns, created with Blender's geometry nodes and Blender's procedural shader nodes. And if you'd like to purchase the hanging paper lanterns product, then you can purchase it on my Gumroad store as well as the Blender Market and some other online sites with the link in the description. And then after I show you how to use the product, the rest of this video will be a tutorial showing you how to create it yourself if you'd like to make it yourself. But if you'd like to help support me and this channel, then you can purchase the product with the links in the description. So when you purchase the product, you will get this Blender file with the paper lanterns. So if I just select this object here and hit the tab key to go into edit mode, you can see that this object is a curve object. And so this object is the cable or the cord which the lanterns will hang on. And so you can select the handles and you can move the handles around, and you can also scale them, and that will change the shape of the cord and change where the lanterns are hanging. And you can also select the end of the cable and you can hit E to extrude, and you can bring it down and then scale it up, and so you could make the cable or the cord look like it's hanging on some rafters, or just place it around your scene. And then if you select the object and go over here to the modifier properties, we have the paper lanterns geometry node setup, and we have some different custom settings for the paper lanterns. So there is the lanterns distance, so you can turn this down or turn it up depending on the distance you want between the lanterns. We also have the lantern scale to make them bigger or smaller. There's also this random seed value to change the seed of where the lanterns are. And then we also have this amount if you want there just to be less lanterns. And then we also have this lantern rotation, and this will randomly rotate the lanterns around on the Z-axis to give them a slight rotation. And then as well as that, we have some custom node groups for the procedural materials. So we have the different colors here. So color 1 is just going to be that black color of those horizontal lines. And then color 2 is going to be the color of the paper lanterns. Then we also have the scale, and so this will just change the size of those lines. And then we also have the vertical lines, so you can make much more vertical lines if you want to on the paper lanterns. Then we also have the roughness of the paper, and if you turn the roughness all the way down, it kind of looks like it's made out of glass, or if you turn it up, it just kind of looks more like a paper lantern. And then we also have the lines bump strength, and then we have the noise bump strength to change the amount of bump there on the paper. And then over here we also have another procedural node setup for the light, which is inside the lantern. So we have colors 1 and 2, and so each lantern is going to randomly have a color which is generated between color 1 and 2. So you can see some of them are more yellow, whereas other ones are more red. And so you can change these colors. For instance, I might have one color which is green, and then I might have another one which is blue. And then also it would be a good idea to change this color here, color 2. So I might just make this kind of like a gray color. And now you can see that each paper lantern is randomly going to be a different color between green and blue. And then we also have the brightness of the paper lanterns. And then finally we have this hue value, so I can just change the hue of the color of the light if I want to. Now if you've purchased the product and you want to add the paper lanterns into your Blender file to use in your projects, then just open up the Blender file that you want to add it into, and then you can click on File, and then you can click on Append. Then you can just locate to the product files, and you can click on the paper lanterns Blender file. You can go inside that Blender file, and then you want to go here to Object, and you want to add the paper lanterns cord. So I'm going to double click on this to append it in, and so now it's been appended into this Blender file, and so I can add it to my projects. And so you can use this product to add hanging lanterns to your scene. So this example scene right here, this is like an alleyway that I've made, and if I go into the camera view, you can see there's hanging lanterns hanging between these two brick walls. So I can go up into the rendered view, kind of preview that, and you can see there's hanging lanterns throughout the scene. So again, if you'd like to purchase the paper lanterns product, you can purchase it with the links in the description, and that's a great way to help support this channel. But now in the rest of this video, I'll be showing you how to create the paper lanterns yourself. So I've pulled up a blank scene in Blender, and I have my screencast keys right down here in the corner so you can see what buttons I'm pressing. So I'm just going to start by selecting everything, and I will just delete everything. So let's now create the lantern. So I'll press Shift A for the add menu. Let's go to mesh, and I'm going to add a UV sphere. Now the default primitive objects in Blender are quite large. They're a little bit higher than an average human, so this is a very big sphere. So I will scale this object down, and I'll type in 0.2 and then enter, and that is a much better size for a paper lantern. And then I will press Ctrl A, and I'm just going to apply the scale, so this is the new default size of the object. So I'll now hit the tab key to go into edit mode, and I want to create those little cylinder parts which are on the top and the bottom. So I will hold down the Alt key and just select that loop of vertices there, and I will press Shift D to duplicate. I'll bring it up on the Z-axis, and then I will scale this up so it's a bit bigger, and I'll bring it down on the Z-axis and bring it inside the lantern, and then I can extrude it, and I'll extrude it up on the Z-axis, bring it about that high up, and then I will press the F key to fill those faces. And then you can see there's some weird shading issues, and that's because I need to recalculate the normals. So I will select everything, and then I'll use Shift N to recalculate the normals. Alright, now I want to put this top part on the bottom part as well. So I'm going to hover my mouse over this top part. I'll press the L key to select the linked vertices, and I can press Shift D to duplicate, bring it down on the Z-axis, and then I want to rotate it around. So I will rotate it on the X-axis, and I'll type in 180, and then hit enter, so it's rotated over, and then I can bring it up on the Z-axis just like that. So if I go back to object mode, you can see it's starting to look a bit like a paper lantern. Now you can see it's very rough, and so I want to make this smooth, so I will use the object context menu, and we're going to use the shade auto smooth. And by using the shade auto smooth, the vertices going around here are going to be smooth, but then the vertices right here, or this edge, is going to be flat. Alright, so I'm going to make a new object now. So back in object mode, I'll press Shift C, and Shift C will make sure the 3D cursor is in the very center of the scene. So I can now press Shift A. Let's go to mesh, and I can add a plane because we're going to be creating the top handle for the lantern. So I will move it up on the Z-axis, and I will scale it way down until it is quite small and bring it down a bit. And I'll scale it down a bit smaller, and then once that is to a better size, just a really small size like that, I'll press Ctrl A and I'll just apply the scale. So I now want to add a mirror modifier to the object so I can just model one side. So let's go here to the modifiers. I'll click on add modifier, and we can add the mirror modifier. And then if I tab to go into edit mode, I can bring the object over on the Y-axis. I'll just bring it over there. And then you can see the mirror modifier isn't showing up. That's because I need to turn on the Y on the axis here and turn off the X. So I also want to turn on the clipping button right here, and this way if I move the object back and stick it in there, I'll move it back on the Y-axis. Now those vertices there which are touching are going to be merged together because we turned the clipping on. So let's just select these two vertices here, and I'll press 1 on the numpad, actually 3 on the numpad to go to side view. So I'll now hit E to extrude. We're going to extrude this part out. Let's bring it down here. Let's also hold down the Z button, go into wireframe, and I'm going to box select both of these vertices and just move them out a little bit so that the distance is more even. We can deselect everything, just box select this one here, bring it down, and then again extrude it and extrude it again, and we're just going to model that little handle there on the top. So we'll extrude that down there, and then I can select everything, and I want to scale everything up a little bit on the Z-axis, and I can bring it in and maybe rotate it a little bit, so just like that. So if I go back to solid view, you can see now we have that little handle there. So I'm going to go back to object mode now, and I want to give it some thickness. So we'll select the object, let's click on add modifier, and we can add the solidify modifier right down here under generate, and then you can drag this thickness value to change that thickness, and let's bring it up, make it a little bit bigger, and then I can go into edit mode, and I will move the entire thing in a little bit just so it's touching the top there of the lantern, just like that. So I now want to add a subdivision surface to smooth it out. So let's click on add modifier, and under generate we can add the subdivision surface. Let's scroll down here, and on the levels viewport and render, we're just going to turn these both to 1. And I can also click right here to minimize the solidify, and I can minimize the mirror just so we can see that a bit better. And then I want to use the object context menu, and I'm just going to shade it smooth. Now I want to sharpen the edges, so if I hit the tab key to go into edit mode, I'll zoom in here, and I'll press Ctrl R to add a loop cut, click, drag over and click there, and then Ctrl R to add another loop cut, click there and drag over and place it there. So you can see by dragging these two loop cuts there on the edges, it kind of thickens up that handle. Let's also add another loop cut here by pressing Ctrl R, clicking and dragging down, but don't drag all the way down, just drag it down about that far. Alright, so let's go back to object mode, and I now want to add one more object, which is going to be a string, which is connecting the handle and going up to the cord. So I'll press Shift C to center the 3D cursor, and I can press Shift A, and let's add a cube. So I can scale the cube way down and bring it up on the Z-axis and make it very, very small. So just really tiny. So I can go into edit mode, and I can now scale this up on the Z-axis. Let's bring that up there and maybe bring it down on the Z-axis a bit. So something like that. Alright, and then back in object mode, I'll shade the object smooth with the object context menu. I'm also going to press Ctrl A and apply the scale, so this is the object's new default size. And then one more thing that I want to do is I want to create the light in the center. So again, I'll press Shift C to make sure this 3D cursor is in the very center of the scene. So I can press Shift A, and let's go here, and we're going to add an icosphere. And then I will hit Tab to go into edit mode, and I can scale the icosphere way down. I can also go into the wireframe view to see that in the wireframe, and I want to scale it down and make it quite small, so just something like that. Maybe just a little bit bigger, and then I can go back to object mode. Alright, so there is the modeling of the lantern. So I want to join this all together into one object. So to join it together into one object, all the modifiers need to be applied, or they need to be using the same modifiers. So we're just going to make sure all the modifiers are applied by clicking and dragging to select all the objects. And with all the objects selected, we can click on object, and we can go here to convert, and we'll just convert it to a mesh. It's already a mesh, but we're just reconverting it to a mesh, and that will apply all the modifiers. So if I go into edit mode, you can see there's actual geometry there. So I now want to join these all together into one object. So with all of them selected, I can press Ctrl J. Ctrl J will join them together into one object. And then I need to use the object context menu again, and I'm going to shade auto smooth. And that way you can see there, that place there is really sharp, but then the rest of it is smooth. Now when we add this object to the geometry nodes, the objects are going to be distributed wherever the object's origin is. And the object origin is that little orange dot there. So I want to hit Tab to go into edit mode. I want to bring the entire mesh down. So select the mesh in edit mode, bring it down on the Z-axis, and I want to make sure that the top of the mesh is right there where the origin is. And that way the lanterns will be hanging from the origin. So I can go back to object node, and then finally I just want to press Ctrl A and apply the scale to make sure that's the object's new default size. Alright, so I want to do the materials, but before I do the materials I want to have some lighting to actually preview the objects. So let's add some lighting now. So I'm going to be using an HDRI from polyhaven.com, and I'll leave the link in the description to the HDRI that I'm going to be using if you want to use the same HDRI. So let's click here on the world properties to add in the HDRI, and right here on color I can click on this yellow dot here, and I can choose environment texture, and then I will just click on open. So here is the HDRI that I'm going to be using, and I downloaded the 1K HDR version. So again, this HDRI is free on polyhaven.com, and I'll have the link in the description if you'd like to download it. So let's now click on open image, and then I can hold down the Z button and move my mouse up into the rendered view, and we can see how that lighting looks. And also to make the lighting a bit nicer, let's click over here on the render properties, and let's go down here to the color management, and I'm going to be using the view transform of Filmic, and also the look here, I'll be changing this to very high contrast. And then also here on the rendering engine, I'm going to be using Cycles render because I am going for realism, and Cycles is more realistic, so I'll be using the Cycles rendering engine. And then also, if you want to make the background transparent so that you can't see it in the background, you can open up the Film tab here, and you can checkmark the transparent button, so that way the HDRI will still light the scene, but you can't see it in the background. And also I forgot to save the project, so we should definitely do that. So let's click here on File and click on Save As. And just save the Blender file somewhere on your computer with your other project files, and I will click on Save As. So then you can press Ctrl S as you're working on the project to save the file. So now that we've done the lighting, we can do the materials. So let's click on the lantern object, and I'm going to click right here to go to the shader editor. So over here on the shader editor, I have the 3D viewport right over here, and I'll go into the rendered mode, and then I have the shader editor right here. So let's click on new here to add a new material to the lantern. And here on the name, I'll just rename this to Paper Lantern. And then I will also be using the Node Wrangler add-on to preview the different nodes. So if you don't have the Node Wrangler enabled, you can click on Edit and you can go to the Preferences. And then over there on the Add-ons tab, just search for Node Wrangler and you can checkmark the Node Wrangler add-on. So to start off, I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for the wave texture. Let's drop the wave texture down here, and then I can Control Shift and select the wave texture to preview it, and that'll preview it on the object. And then also with the wave texture selected, I'll press Ctrl T to add the texture coordinate and mapping nodes. And I want to use the object coordinates, so let's plug the object into the vector of the mapping. And then right here on this X, I want to change it to Z instead, so that the lines are rotating around in a circle. And let's also change the size. So here on the scale, I'm going to turn this up to a 10, but then I'll leave all the other settings how they are. Now I want to make these lines smaller, so I want to make them more contrasty. So I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for a color ramp, and let's put the color ramp after the wave texture, and then I can drag the white tab over and I can drag the black tab over, and when they're closer together you can see they're going to be much more contrasty. So I'll drag the white tab way over here and the black tab over there, so now there's these little horizontal lines. So I now want to create the colors for the lantern, so I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for the mix color, and let's put the mix color here after the color ramp. I can click and drag to select these nodes, and I'll just move them back a bit. And then make sure you Control Shift and select the mix to preview it. Now I want the color ramp color to be going into the factor. So the factor is determining where it's going to be color A and where it's going to be color B. So for color A, I want to make this fully black so that the lines are fully black. And then here on color B, I want to make this a light kind of tannish peachy color. And if you want to use the same exact value that I'm using, you can go to the hex value and you can punch in CC915A. So I've made the horizontal lines, but I also want to create the vertical lines. So I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search, and I'm going to add the gradient texture. Let's drop the gradient above the wave, and I want to use the object coordinates. So let's put the vector of the mapping into the vector of the gradient texture. And I can Control Shift and select the gradient texture to preview it. Now I want to click on the linear here, and I want to change it to radial instead. So that way over here on this side it's fully black, and then as it goes around it gets lighter. But I want to have many little lines, so I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for the math node, and let's put the math node after the gradient. And this first math node I want to change to multiply. So under functions here we're going to choose multiply. So now if I turn this up, you can see it is making that more contrasty. It's adding more light values. And then to make there be many lines, I'm going to click on the multiply, I'll press Shift D to duplicate it and drop it over here, and I'm going to click on the type, and under rounding I'm going to use the ping pong. So right there, ping pong. Now if I turn this value up, you can see instead of it just getting lighter, it's now adding many more lines. So this multiply value can be changed to change the amount of lines. So I'm going to turn the value to 8 just so that there are 8 lines. So I now want to make these lines contrasty as well. So I'll click on this color ramp and I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'll drop this color ramp after the ping pong. I'm just going to zoom in here, and I will drag the white tab over here, and I'm going to drag the black tab over here just so that those lines are a little bit bigger. So just something like that. So we now have the vertical lines and the horizontal lines, and I want to mix them together. So I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search, and I'm going to add another mix color. Let's drop the mix color after the color ramp, and on this mix color here, I want to change the type to darken instead, just so it adds the dark values. And then this top color ramp, I'm going to put this into color B, and then this mix right here, I'm going to put that into color A. So now if I turn the factor up, you can see it's just adding the dark values from the color ramp, and so it's making those vertical lines darker. I'm going to leave the factor at 0.5 though, just so that it is a bit more subtle, and you can kind of see through it. So I can now take the darken here, and let's put that into the base color, and I can Control Shift and select the principled shader to preview it. Now I want to turn the roughness up a bit, so here on the roughness, I will turn that to a 0.7, and then also to make it look more like paper, I want light to be able to go through it. So this transmission here, I'm going to turn this to a 0.8, and now light can go through that and it looks like an actual paper lantern. Now I also want these lines to be a bit bumpy. So I'm going to take this color ramp color here, and I'm going to plug this into the normal, but then we need to convert it to normal data because you can see the shading looks a bit weird. So I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for a bump node, and let's put the bump node between the color ramp and the principled shader. And the color ramp color is going to go in the height value of the bump, and that'll convert it to actual normal data. So you can see now if I look on the edges there, you can see that actually looks bumpy. But it is a bit too strong, so I'm going to turn the strength to a 0.4, but you can see now those black areas look like they're popping in. Alright, now to make this look a bit more like paper, I want to add a subtle bumpy texture over this object. Before I do that though, one small thing I notice is if I zoom into this color ramp, I think I want to make these lines a little bit smaller, so I'm going to drag the black tab back a little bit and the white tab over just a little bit, so it's a little bit thinner. I think that looks a little bit better. Alright, so to create that other subtle bump over the material, I'll press Shift A, and I'll go to the search, and I'll search for the noise texture. And then let's plug the mapping vector into the vector of the noise texture, and I'll Control Shift and select the noise texture to preview it. and let's change some of the settings. So I'm going to turn the scale up to 60, and the detail here, I'll turn the max to 15, and then here on the roughness, I'll turn this up a bit to a 0.65. So I'm now going to be putting this into the bump as well. So I'm going to click on this bump node and I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and I can drop it here after the first one. So the normal can go through the normal, and so this way we can mix multiple bump maps together. So this noise texture factor can go into the height value of this bump, and I can Control Shift and select it to preview it. And you can see it's way too strong. So let's turn the strength here to down to just like a 0.1, so it's much more subtle. And I can Control Shift and select the principled shader to preview it. So you can see now there's just a very subtle bump, and it makes it look more like paper. And then there is one more bump that I want to add, and that is going to be a little bit of bump going from each line. So it's going to be a subtle bump, making it look like it's going back in. So to do that, I want to press Shift A, and I want to go to the search, and I'm going to search for another wave texture. Let's drop the wave texture down here, and I want to take the mapping vector, and I want to put that into the vector, so it's using the object coordinates. And let's Control Shift and select the wave texture to preview it. And right here on the X, I want to change this to Z so that the lines are going back and forth. And I'm going to leave the scale at 5. So what I can do is take this bump node here, and I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and let's drop it here in between both of these two. And I want to take this wave texture color, and let's put that into the height value of the bump, and I can Control Shift and select the bump to preview it. Now that doesn't really look that good. If I Control Shift and select the principled shader, you can see that bump is way too strong, so I want to make it much more subtle. So I'll press Shift A, and I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for the RGB curves, and let's put the RGB curves after the wave texture. So now what I want to do is make sure I'm on the color one here, so click on the C for color, and I'm going to click here to add a dot, and then I can click on this dot, and I can drag this dot way down here. So basically this shape of the RGB curves is going to be the shape of the bump. So if I drag this way up here, you can see now it looks like it's bumping out. Of course it's actually flat, but it looks like it's bumping out. But if I drag this way down and I drag it very small, now you can see it's going to be much more subtle. So then right over here, I do want this bump strength to be set to 0.4. You can turn it up and down if you want. I'll leave it at 0.4, but I also want to click on the invert button, and that way now you can see that this point right here, in between those horizontal lines, they look like they're going back in. If I turn the strength up, you can see it looks like they're going back in even more. So we have those nice little dips which are going back in, and it gives the lanterns a bit more shape and makes it look more like a paper lantern. Alright, so that paper lantern material is finished. Now I want to have a different material for these other spots here on the top and the bottom because I don't want those lines there. So I'm going to select the object and let's go into edit mode, and then I want to deselect everything, and I'm just going to press the L key with my mouse hovered over these objects here and these objects, and also hover your mouse over this object and press the L key. So now what I want to do is I want to make this a separate material. So I'm going to click on the plus here to add a new material in the material slot. Let's click on the drop down and we can choose the paper lantern, and then I can click on this button here and that will duplicate the material. And I'm going to double click on this to rename it, and I'm going to rename this one instead to lantern handle. And then with the lantern handle selected, I can just click on assign. So I can go back to object mode, and then I just want to get rid of all of these procedural nodes. So I'll click and drag to box select all these nodes, and I'll hit the X key to delete it. Now I want to use the same colors as the color that I'm using for that paper. So I'm going to click back on the paper lantern, and right here I want to click on this color here, and I want to copy the color. So you can copy the hex value right here, or you can just hover your mouse over the color value and you can press Ctrl C to copy that value. Then you can click on the paper lantern or the lantern handle, and you can hover your mouse over the color and press Ctrl V to paste that color. So you can see they now have the same color. Alright, so now I want to create the light inside the lantern, so I'll go into edit mode, and I'm going to zoom in to the lantern, and I'll deselect everything, and then just hover your mouse over this inside part, and press the L key to select that icosphere there. So let's now click on the plus here to add a new material. Let's click on new, and I can just rename this material to light. And then here on the materials, I just want to press Shift A, go to the search, and I want to search for the emission, and let's drop the emission here. After the principled, let's drop it there, and we can click on the principled and just press the X key to delete it. So then make sure that part is selected, make sure the light is selected, and click on assign. So I can zoom out here, and if I tab to go back to object mode, I can now turn the strength up, and you can see there's now a light inside the lantern. So here on the emission, I'm going to turn this up to 200. I think 200 is a pretty good size. Now I want each light to be a slightly different color. So to do this, I'll press Shift A and I'll go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the object info node. Let's drop this down here, and the object info node has this random value. Now each object is randomly going to be a different color from white to black if we put the random into the color. So let's put the random into the color, and so now each time I duplicate this, it'll be a randomly different color from white to black. You can see if I duplicate this, like this one's darker and this one's lighter, and if I continue to duplicate these, this one is like the most light, so they're going to be randomly different colors. So I'm just going to delete those and keep this one. But instead of them being colors from white to black, I want to choose the colors that I want. So I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for the mix color, and let's drop the mix color down here in between the object info and the emission. So the random can go into the factor, and then we can choose the different colors that we want. So this first color here is going to be a very bright color, and it's also going to be kind of a yellow color. And then this color here is going to be a bright color, and it will be orange. And if you want to use the same exact colors that I'm using here on color A, you can go to the hex value and you can punch in E5, C285. And then here on color B, if you go to the hex value, you can punch in FF7129. Now I do want to make this a little bit more contrasty so it's a bit easier to see. So I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search, and I'll search for the color ramp, and let's put the color ramp in between the random and the mix, and then I can drag both of these together, just kind of drag it like that, and that'll kind of compress the colors so that it is more contrasty because we're bringing these colors together. And then I also want to be able to control the hue, so I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search, and I'll search for the hue saturation value, and we can drop the hue saturation value after this mix. So now this hue is going to change the hue, and it is a little bit hard to see. It doesn't look like it's taking effect that much, but that is because of the color of the paper. So you can also change the color of the paper to be able to see that better. Alright, so I'm now going to be joining these materials that I've created into some custom node groups so that we can control them better. So I'm going to click and drag and box select all of these nodes in the light material, but I'm not going to select the material output. And I'll press Ctrl G to join it together into a node group. So if I press the tab key to go outside of the node group, I can drag the node group over here, and I'll drag it out to make it bigger. And I'm just going to rename this to light. So now if I go back inside the node group, we have this group input here, and we can plug values up to this group input to control those values outside of the node group. So I first want to add the colors. So let's take color A, put that into the group input, and then color B, put that into the extra socket there. And if I press the N key to open up the side panel, I can go here to group, and I can just rename this. So I'm going to rename this one to color 1, and I'm going to rename this one to color 2. And then I also want to be able to control the brightness. So let's go over here to the emission. We can take the strength and plug that into the extra socket. And I can just double click on this to rename it. And I'm going to rename it to brightness. And then finally, I want to be able to control the hue. So let's take the hue and just put that into the extra socket there on the group input. So I'll press the tab key to go outside of the node group, and you can see we now have this light material. So we have the different custom colors that you can change, and then also the brightness and also the hue. So that is it for the light, but I also want to do the paper lantern, and I want to create a custom node group for that as well. So I'm going to click on the paper lantern, and I'm going to zoom out here, and we're going to create a custom node group for this. And here's the material output. I'll drag that over there. So what I want to do now is box select all the nodes except the material output, and I'm doing that on the paper lantern material. So I'll now press Ctrl G to join it together into a node group. I'll press the tab key to go out of the node group, and I'll drag the node group over here, and I'll just pull it out just like that. And then I can double click on it to rename it, and I'm going to rename it to paper lantern. Alright, so let's hit the tab key to go back into the node group, and here on this output, I'm going to double click on this, and I'll rename that to shader because I like that a bit better. So let's now add all of the custom values. So I'm going to take this group input, and I'm going to drag it kind of over here over this mix, and I'm going to take color A, put that into the group input, and also color B, I'll put that into the group input. And then I can double click on this to rename it, and I'll rename it to color 1, and also I'll rename this to color 2. And then I also want to be able to control the scale. So let's drag this group input back over here. Let me make this smaller so we have a bit more space. And I want to take the scale value here on the mapping, and I want to put that into the extra socket. And this mapping node is plugged up to all the textures, so it'll change the scale of the entire material. Now, if you go right here and click on the scale, I don't want this to be 3 values. I instead want it to be 1 value. So I'll click on the vector, and I'm going to change it to float instead. Now on the default value, I want to change that to 1, and then if I tab to go outside of the node group, I will turn this scale just to 1. So now I can just scale that material. I'll turn it back to 1, and let's go back into the node group. Now I also want to control how many vertical lines there are. So this multiply, I can drag this around to change how many vertical lines there are. So we'll take the multiply value here and we'll put that into the extra socket. And then if I double click on this, I'll rename this one to vertical lines. Then I want to be able to control the roughness. So let's drag the group input right over here and let's take the roughness value. I can put that into the extra socket there. And then we have these two bumps here and they are both at 0.4 and they are controlling the bumps of those lines there. So let's take the bump strength, put that to the extra socket here, and this bump strength, let's put that into the same socket, and that way this socket here is going to control both of them at the same time. Let's click and drag to make this a bit smaller, and then if I double click on this to rename it, I'm going to rename it to lines bump strength. And then I also want to be able to control this bump strength here, and that is going to be the paper. So it's going to be that noisy texture on the paper. So let's take the strength and I can put that into the extra socket there. And then I'm just going to double click on this to rename it, and I'm going to rename it to paper bump strength. All right, so let's drag the group input right back over here. I will hit the tab key to go outside of the node group and the N key to close the side panel. And so now we have the paper lantern material with the different colors. So we have color 1 and we also have color 2. Then we also have the scale and the vertical lines, and we also have the roughness and the lines bump strength and then the paper bump strength. All right, so that is it for the lantern with the customizable materials. So we're now going to be adding a curve object and then using geometry nodes to put the lanterns on the curve. So let's go back here to the layout and I'll go back into the solid view and I'll press Shift A and let's go down here to curve, and I'm just going to add a normal Bezier curve. So let's hit the tab key to go into edit mode, and I'm just going to do some basic modeling and place the curve where I want. So I'm going to rotate the handle, kind of move it over here, select this handle, kind of move that over. And then if I select both handles, I can use the object context menu and I can click on subdivide. So I can now select the handle in the middle since we've subdivided it, and I can bring that handle down on the Z-axis. And then this one here, let's scale it down. And also this one over here, scale that down a bit. And then I can select the handle here on one of the sides and I can extrude it, bring it down and scale that out, make it a bit longer, and then extrude that up and scale it up just like that. So now it looks like some cords maybe hanging on some rafters or hanging on some kind of outdoor setting. So let's go back to object mode and I'm going to zoom in to the curve, and I want to go right here to the object data property so that we can give it some thickness. So let's open up the geometry here, and then we're going to go to the bevel, and right here we're going to turn the bevel depth up. So the bevel depth is going to change the thickness of that chord. But I do want it to be pretty thin, so I'm going to turn the depth to a 0.007. All right, and then I want to add a basic material to this object, so let's click on the object. We can go to the material properties and I can click on new, and we're just going to rename this material to cord. And then here on the base color, I just want to make this very, very dark, not fully dark, but pretty dark. And here on the roughness, I'll just turn this to like a 0.3, so it's a bit more reflective. So now if I go up into the rendered view, you can see we just have a basic cord material. I'm going to turn the roughness up to like a 0.4 so that it's not quite that shiny. So I'm now going to be adding geometry nodes onto this cord to add the lanterns onto the cord. So let's click right over here on the geometry nodes workspace, and if you don't have the geometry nodes workspace, you can click on the plus here to add a new workspace, and you can go here to general and you can add geometry nodes. I'm going to go here to the geometry nodes workspace. So I have the 3D viewport right here, and then I have the geometry node editor right over here. So I can click on new here to add new geometry nodes, and we're adding it to the cord object. All right, so to create the geometry node setup, I'm going to start by pressing Shift A, and I'll go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the distribute points on faces. So let's add the distribute points on faces. Let's stick this here, and then I also need to press Shift A, and I need to go to the search, and I need to search for the instance on points. So this one here, instance on points. Now you can see that the object has disappeared. That's because we need to press Shift A and go to the search, and we need to search for a join geometry and put this at the very end. And we need to take the original geometry and put that after the join geometry so that now we can see the original geometry. So we can now use these two nodes here to instance the lantern object on the cord. So I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for the object info node. Let's drop this here. And then if I drag this out, I want to click here to see the scene collection, and I want to rename the curve to cord. And then if I click here on the plane, this is the lantern. So I'm going to rename this to lantern. All right. Alright, so I'll select the chord object again, and now if we click here on the drop down to see all the objects, we can select the lantern, and we want to put the geometry of the object info into the instance. So now you can see the lanterns are on the object there. Now I want to add a random rotation, so I'll press Shift A, and I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for the random value node. Let's drop this here, and I want to click on the float, and I want to change it to vector instead, so that I can control the X, Y, and Z values. So now I want to put the random value into the rotation, and so that way now we have the minimum and maximum values to control the rotation. So we have the X rotation and the Y, and then also the Z. So I'm going to start by turning these all to 0. So I'll turn all of the max values to 0. And then I want to turn these top two to a 0.15. So that one a 0.15 and this one a 0.15. And so this one is just the Y and the X. And so this way each lantern is going to be randomly rotated sideways. Now here on the Z, I want to rotate this one around a lot. And so that'll rotate the Z and it'll make it more random. So I'm going to turn this one to a large number of 1,000 here on the bottom maximum value. And then the minimum value, I'll just leave that at 0. Now let's go up here to the distribute points on faces, and you can see some of them are close and then other ones have a very far distance. So let's click on the random and we're going to change this to the Poisson disk instead. So now we can change the distance min and the max. So here on the max, I'm going to turn this to 135 so that they're all closer, so that basically there's a lot more of them. But then here on the distance minimum, I want there to be a bit more distance because you can see most of these are going through each other. So on the distance min, I'm going to turn that to a 0.15. And you can drag this around and play with it if you want them to be closer or farther, but I think a distance min of 1.5 is pretty good, so there's a bit of a distance between each one, and then you can also change that distance max. And then there's also the factor, just to get rid of more of them if you want to, and then of course there's a random seed, just to change where they are randomly. So we can plug values up to this group input, and when we plug values up to the group input, we'll be able to control it right over here on this modifier. So I first want to take the density min, and let's plug that in there, and then if I click on the group input and press the N key to open up the side panel, I can go here to group, and I want to rename the distance min, and I want to call it lantern distance because it is the distance between the lanterns. Now I also want to be able to control the scale of the lanterns, so we can take this scale value here and let's drag this over, and we're going to put it right there. And then if I go here and double click on this to rename it, I'm going to rename it to lantern scale. But then you can see that it's 3 values, and I instead want it to just be 1 value. So let's click on the vector here, and I want to change it to float instead, so it's 1 value, and then we need to make the default value back to 1. And then if we go over here on the side panel to the lantern scale, I want to make that 1 as well. And then I want to be able to control the seed value as well, so let's put the seed into the extra socket there, and also the density factor, let's put that into the extra socket as well. And then I want to be able to control the lantern rotation. Now I don't want to rotate these 2 values here, this is the X and the Y, I just want to rotate the Z. But this maximum value, this is 1 single value. So I need to add another node to break up these 3 values. So I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for the combine XYZ node. Let's drop this here. So then we can copy these values and put it into these ones so that they have the same values. So the Z one is going to be 1000 and the Y is going to be a 0.15 and the X is a 0.15 as well. So you can see these values are the same as these values. So let's put the vector into the max, and then we just have this 1 single value to control the Z. So we'll put this one into the extra socket, and if I drag this down, I want to click on this to rename it, and I'll rename this one to lantern rotation. Alright, so I'll press the N key to close the side panel. Let's actually go back here to the layout, and I can click here to go to the modifiers. So I can hold down the Z button and go up into the rendered view just to preview how this is looking. And let's just review the geometry nodes, and I actually do want to rename the geometry nodes. So I'll rename this to paper lanterns. Alright, so we have the lantern's distance, so you can make them farther away or closer. Then we also have the lantern scale. We also have the random seed if you want to change that. And then we also have this density factor to get rid of some of the lanterns. And then we also have the lantern rotation. So you can now just select the handles in edit mode, and you can extrude them, and you can just add paper lanterns and just decorate your 3D scene. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and thank you for watching. And if you'd like to help support the channel, you can purchase the finished product files on my Gumroad store and the Blender Market and some other sites with the links in the description, and that's a great way to help support this channel. But I hope you enjoyed this, and thank you for watching.